Alrighty, welcome back to another thrilling installment of Fraggoth Reads. I'm your intrepid narrator, Fraggoth, and today I'm going to read some short stories from MIT Press's More Voices from the Radium Age. They've got a whole series of these. Not so much short story collections, they've got a lot of novels from that time period that have been converted over, or republished, I should say, rediscovered, republished. But they do have some short story collections. One they've got out now is Bengali science fiction, which I definitely want to get a hold of. One they have coming out next year is early Afrofuturism, which I'm really looking forward to. That should have some... I'm pretty sure that'll have some W.E.B. Du Bois in there. And he, as we know from the last one of these that we did, he's really good. When he's not, fighting the good fight. He's also a very good author. Shocker, I know. Guy who did writing for a living? Crazy thought. So... we have kind of been here before. These are some new stories, old stories, but I will be blind reading these. I have, to my knowledge, not read a single one of these at any point in time. I may have heard of one or two of them. One of the ones we're reading today by H.G. Wells I am dimly aware of. I'm looking through the list here that they've got, and I'll be honest with you, I don't recognize any immediately beyond that one, and that one is a maybe I've only heard of this, and the only reason I know about it is because I had, there was a length of time when I had a burning interest/infatuation with Keith Laumer's Bolos series. Or Bolo series, which is about a bunch of futuristic super tanks. We all have our phases. Actually, some of the Bolo stories are legitimately quite good. It's a cool setting, I should say. It's a cool setting. And this is sort of like in a way, a prototype of some of the ideas there, but only sort of. Let's see. Which reminds me, actually, at some point I've got to get around to reading some of the Hammers Slammers series by David Drake. Some really good, fairly grounded military sci-fi about a mercenary tank company / battalion. Or a mercenary company that focuses on hover tank warfare. A lot of the stories wind up being very the things they carried, but like in the not too distant future, 3-something AD. Here's a guy named Joel, not too different from you or me. He worked at Gizmotic Institute, just another guy in a red jumpsuit. Spent all his time cleaning up the place, but his bosses didn't like him, so they shot him into space. Very strange stuff, really. Anyway, we'll get around to those. Those are pretty good. One of the later ones has, like, a bonkers, like, meta twist that's kind of crazy. Like, actual plot consequences. Like, for the series ongoing, and I don't know how much further he went beyond that. But it's quite good, but less said about that, the better. For spoiler purposes. Suffice it to say, I thought they were pretty good at the time. I haven't read them in a while, so they might not be. Anyway, back to the task at hand. These are all, like every single one of these stories was written between 1900 and 1930. So this is before the golden age of sci-fi starts kicking into gear in a real way. This is before you get sci-fi pulp culture. So this is pre-E.E. Doc Smith. I promise I'll get around to some of his work eventually. This is pre... what was it called? It's the other one. Star Wolf? Oh, some of those are really good, too. How having a massive brain fart, and I can't remember the author either. Another good sci-fi pulp series from around that time, from the 30s, 40s, 50s era. But this is right as sci-fi is kind of really kicking into gear. So these are historically relevant. So we've got kind of two introductions here. We have a series forward where Joshua Glenn explains the purpose of the mission, so to speak, and then we have an introduction where he discusses a little bit more in depth, and we're going to read through those. It also discusses. Actually, let me skim this one real quick. If it's got like descriptions of each short story, I might not want to do that, but let's real quick. Just skimming here. I know, boring for you guys. This does actually have descriptions of all of these, so I might actually save the introduction for the last one. But actually, no, we'll go ahead and do it. This will probably be the longest chunk of the book we do, because the stories take up something like 50 pages, the two that I have picked out. Plus, like, what is it? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10-ish pages of introduction. But the pages are also much shorter than, say, Sci-Teen. So it should go by faster? Question mark? Anyway. Give me a moment here. Find where I dropped my page. Aha! There it is. You know, we might as well do this formally. Give me a sec to slurp down some water, and we'll rock and roll in a sec. Sorry about the lengthy interlude there. I decided I could breathe water faster than I could drink it. So, here we are. Off to a good start. I don't know what that noise was. It went funk, though. More Voices from the Radium Age. From MIT Press. Edited and introduced by Joshua Glenn. Series Forward by Joshua Glenn. Do we really know science fiction? There were the scientific romance years that stretched from the mid 19th century to circa 1900. And there was the genre's so-called Golden Age, from circa 1935 through the early 1960s. But between those periods, and overshadowed by them, was an era that has bequeathed us such tropes as the robot, berserk or benevolent, the tyrannical Superman, the dystopia, the unfathomable extraterrestrial, the sinister telepath, and the eco-catastrophe. A dozen years ago, writing for the SF blog io9.com at the invitation of Annalee Newitz and Charlie Jane Anders, I became fascinated with the period during which the SF genre as we know it emerged. Inspired by the exactly contemporaneous career of Marie Curie, who Marie Curie, who shared a Nobel Prize for her discovery of radium in 1903, only to die of radiation-induced leukemia in 1934, I eventually dubbed this three-decade interregnum the Radium Age. Curie's development of the theory of radioactivity, which led to the extraordinary, terrifying, awe-inspiring insight that the atom is, at least in part, a state of energy constantly in movement, is an apt metaphor for the 20th century's first 3 decades. These years were marked by rising sociocultural strife across various fronts: the founding of the women's suffrage movement, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, socialist currents within the labor movement, anti-colonial and revolutionary upheaval around the world, as well as the associated strengthening of reactionary movements that supported, for example, racial segregation, immigration restriction, eugenics, and sexist policies. Science, as a system of knowledge, science! Sorry. She blinded me with science. Now I'm never going to get that out of my head. Very good. Science! As a system of knowledge, a mode of experimenting, and a method of reasoning, accelerated the pace of change during these years in ways simultaneously liberating and terrifying. As SF author and historian Brian Stableford points out in his 1989 essay, quote, "The Plausibility of the Impossible," unquote, the universe we discovered by means of the scientific method in the early 20th century defies common sense. We are haunted by a sense of the impossibility of ultimately making sense of things. By playing host to certain far-out notions, time travel, faster-than-light travel, and ESP, for example, that we have every reason to judge impossible, science fiction serves as an instrument of negotiation, Stableford suggests, with which we strive to accomplish the difficult diplomacy of existence in a scientifically knowable but essentially unimaginable world. This is no less true today than during the Radium Age. The social, cultural, political, and technological upheavals of the 1900 to 1935 period are reflected in the proto-SF writings of authors such as Olaf Stapledon, William Hope Hodgson, Muriel Jaeger, Karl Čapek, G.K. Chesterton, Cicely Hamilton, W.E.B. Du Bois, Yevgeny Zamyatin, E.V. Odell, Arthur Conan Doyle, Mikhail Bulgakov, Pauline Hopkins, Stanislav Ignacy Vitkevich, Stanislav Ignacy Vitkevich, Aldous Huxley, Gustave Le Rouge, A. Merritt, Rudyard Kipling, Rose Macaulay, J.D. Beresford, J.J. Conington, S. Fowler Wright, Jack London, Thea von Harbaugh, and Edgar Rice Burroughs, not to mention the late period but still incredibly prolific H.G. Wells himself. More cynical than its Victorian precursor, yet less hard-boiled than the SF that followed, in the writings of these visionaries we find acerbic social commentary, shock tactics, and also a sense of frustrated idealism, and reactionary cynicism, too, regarding humankind's trajectory. The MIT Press's Radium Age series represents a much-needed evolution of my own efforts to champion the best proto-SF novels and stories from 1900 to 1935 among scholars already engaged in the fields of utopian and speculative fiction studies, as well as general readers interested in science, technology, history, and thrills and chills. By reissuing literary productions from a time period that hasn't received sufficient attention for its contribution to the emergence of science fiction as a recognizable form, that is a brutal sentence, one that exists and has meaning in relation to its own traditions and innovations, as well as within a broader ecosystem of literary genres, each of which, as John Reeder notes in Science Fiction and the Mass Cultural Genre System in 2017, is itself a product of overlapping communities of practice. We hope not only to draw attention to key overlooked works, but perhaps also to influence the way scholars and SF fans alike think about this crucial yet neglected and misunderstood moment in the emergence of the SF genre. John W. Campbell and other Cold War-era SF editors and propagandists, coming out swinging, dubbed a select group of writers and story types from the pulp era to be the golden age of science fiction. In doing so, they helped fix in the popular imagination a too narrow understanding of what the SF genre can offer. In his introduction to the 1974 collection Before the Golden Age, for example, Isaac Asimov notes that although it may have possessed a certain exuberance, in general, SF from before the mid-1930s moment when Campbell assumed editorship of Astounding Stories, quote, seems to anyone who has experienced the Campbell Revolution to be clumsy, primitive, naive. Unquote. By returning to an international tradition of scientific speculation via fiction from after the Poe-Verne-Wells era and before SF's Golden Age, the Radium Age series will demonstrate, contra Asimov et al., the breadth, richness, and diversity of the literary works that were responding to a vertiginous historical period, and how they helped innovate a nascent genre, which wouldn't be named until the mid-1920s, by Hugo Gernsback, founder of Amazing Stories and namesake of the Hugo Awards, as a mode of speculative imagining. The MIT Press's Noah J. Springer and I are grateful to the SF writers and scholars who have agreed to serve as this series' advisory board. Aided by their guidance, we'll endeavor to surface a rich variety of texts, along with introductions by a diverse group of SF scholars, SF writers, and others that will situate these remarkable, entertaining, forgotten works within their own social, political, and scientific contexts, while drawing out contemporary parallels. We hope that reading Radium Age writings, published in times as volatile as our own, will serve to remind us that our own era's seemingly natural, eternal, and inevitable social, economic, and cultural forms and norms are, like Madame Curie's atom, forever in flux. Introduction. Radium Age Ultra-Potentialities by Joshua Glenn. During the 20th century, the world's scientists were wonderstruck by the revelation that the spontaneous disintegration of atoms, previously assumed to be indivisible and unchangeable, produces powerfully energetic radioactive emissions. Time, space, substance, our understanding of reality itself were called into question. The man of science must have been sleepy indeed, as the author of The Education of Henry Adams would recall, who did not jump from his chair like a scared dog when, in 1898, Madame Curie threw on his desk... What? Oh, the man of science had it thrown on his desk. Sorry, my brain. This is the disadvantage of reading these blind. The man of science must have been sleepy indeed, as the author of The Education of Henry Adams would recall, who did not jump from his chair like a scared dog when, in 1898, Madame Curie threw on his desk the metaphysical bomb she called radium. What Frederick Soddy, the English radiochemist whose lectures would inspire H.G. Wells to predict the atomic bomb, described as the ultra-potentialities of radioactive elements, seemed limitless. Throughout the 1900s and 10s, scientists and snake oil salesmen alike would ascribe to radium, and radiation in general, vitalizing, even life-giving powers. By the 1920s, then, the Soviet biochemist Alexander Oparin and the English biologist J.B.S. Haldane could independently propose that radiation, acting upon our planet's inorganic compounds billions of years ago, had produced a primordial soup from which emerged life. Science fiction, too, emerged during the genre's 1900 to 1935 Radium Age from out of a hot, dilute soup of sorts, this one composed of outre genres of literature, from occult mysteries and paranormal thrillers to Yukon adventures and symbolist poetry, acted upon by the energy of new scientific and technological theories and breakthroughs. If a primary goal of the 2022 Voices from the Radium Age story collection was to showcase the proto-SF writings of authors whom few today would associate with the SF genre, this second collection offers instead an X-ray analysis of the diverse literary milieu out of which science fiction constructed itself. George C. Wallace, author of the earliest story in this collection, first began writing scientific romances, a trilogy set in Atlantis, for example, as well as a riposte to Wells' The War of the Worlds, in which Martians rescue Earth from meteors, during the late Victorian era. He started writing scientific romances during the late Victorian era. There's an M dash blocking that off. I think I mishandled that, but it's okay. He'd continue writing SF right up into the genre's so-called Golden Age. His final novel would appear in 1948, a prolific half a century later. Wallace's The Last Days of Earth, being the story of the launching of the Red Sphere, July 1901, in the Harmsworth magazine, is another Wellesian yarn, this one reminiscent of The Time Machine. Some 13 million years in the future, we find Alwyn and Celia, humankind's designated survivors, channel surfing between real-world scenes of frozen desolation. Sensitive readers may feel creeping into their bones an intimation of the decentering concept, first articulated by the geologist James Hutton and more recently dubbed deep time, that human civilization is fleetingly ephemeral in comparison with the literally glacial workings of nature. Although there are futuristic gadgets here, from a worldwide pictorial telegraph relying on, quote, reflected Marconi waves, unquote, to the titular planetary escape pod itself, this is no gung-ho tale of tech wizardry. Wallace's characters feel, quote, the concentration and culmination of the woes and fears of the ages, unquote. Those of us aware say that the prospect of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius may soon be out of reach can relate to the story's enervating atmosphere. Which is why the story's surprise twist, valorizing passion and an heretical turn of mind, feels oddly hopeful. Hopeful. I'm not enunciating well lately. I have to keep on top of that. Speaking of Wells, one of the prolific author's finest tales from this era predicts battle tanks, which wouldn't be deployed in the real world until the Battle of the Somme in 1916. The Land Ironclads, December 1903, in The Strand, depicts the defeat of a European country's military at the hands of a technologically advanced foe. It's the same plot as The War of the Worlds, really, only instead of Martians, the invaders in armored fighting vehicles are fellow Europeans. The correspondent through whose eyes we witness these events is conflicted. He deplores the rowdy-dowdy types who serve as his country's soldiery, yet when they are slaughtered by button-pushing clerks, slender young men in blue pajamas, who may remind today's readers of drone jockeys fighting video game-like telewars from the comforts of American suburbs, our man in the field inveighs against these smart degenerates. Even as he spouts what Adorno would call the jargon of authenticity, however, he recognizes that war has become pointless. Via subsequent Radium Age SF novels, including The War in the Air, which depicts German Zeppelins devastating New York City, and The World Set Free, which hypothesizes the development of the most destructive weapon the world will ever see, Wells would urgently continue to make the case that there are, in the words of his correspondent, other things in life better worth having than proficiency in war. The Republic of the Southern Cross, which appeared in Valery Bryusov's 1907 collection Zemnaya Os, Earth's Axis, and which was translated into English in 1918, is an account of the fate of Zvezhny. Zvezhny. Okay. Is an account of the fate of Zvezhny, Star City, domed capital of a workers' utopia situated atop the South Pole. A decade before Yevgeny Zamyatin's dystopian We, which explores similar themes, Bryusov asks us to imagine a society in which efficiency has been extended into all spheres of life. The city's temperature and light are regulated, and the life of the citizens was standardized even to the most minute details. Small wonder, then, that a psychical distemper should influence the city's residents to do the opposite of whatever is efficient and reasonable. Hilarity, which soon gives way to gruesomely depicted carnage, ensues. Like other symbolist poets who dabbled in proto-SF writing, Bryusov, a leader of the Russian symbolist movement, was fascinated with the notion that the days shall come of final desolation, to quote one of his poems. We are weary of conventional forms of society, conventional forms of morality, the very means of perception, everything that comes from outside, he denounced in 1903. It is becoming clearer and clearer that if what we see is all there is in the world, then there is nothing worth living for. This could serve as a fitting epitaph for Star City. E. Nesbit, the English author known today for Five Children and It, and other wry, intelligent contemporary fantasies that paved the way for future fantasists from C.S. Lewis to J.K. Rowling, was a friend of H.G. Wells and a prolific writer of horror stories, some of them SF-inflected. Published under her frequent pseudonym E. Bland, Nesbit's The Third Drug, February 1908, in The Strand, is an early example of proto-SF horror. Body-snatched and confined by a mad scientist, our protagonist, Roger, is injected with 2 drugs. It is via the third drug, the scientist claims, that life, splendid superhuman life, is found. Indeed, upon receiving his booster shot, Roger does appear to develop unnatural strength, not to mention a sensation of omniscience. Predating J.D. Beresford's The Hamptonshire Wonder by a year, and other intelligence-oriented Superman stories, John Taine's Seeds of Life, say, or Olaf Stapledon's Last Men in London, by over 2 decades, this is literally heady stuff. It's worth noting that Roger isn't much less scornful of his fellow man than is his kidnapper. During the struggle with Parisian Apaches that precedes his capture, he is disgusted by their pale, degenerate faces and their subhuman odor. In the end, however, he discovers that the old common sense that guides an ordinary man trumps even a Superman's consciousness of illimitable wisdom, and that humanity inheres within even within a hooligan's heart. If Bryusov wished to revolutionize our means of perception, then A Victim of Higher Space, December 1914, in The Occult Review, by the English weird fiction pioneer Algernon Blackwood, which is a familiar name but I'm not sure why, possibly he was Lovecraft adjacent, maybe got included in a collection somewhere. His name's familiar, A Victim of Higher Space is not. Warns those of us who share this goal to be wary. In this sequel to the author's 1908 collection of stories about occult detective John Silence, a psychonaut named Mudge, who has been meditating upon a 4-dimensional cube diagram, seeks Silence's counsel, because he has slipped into a space-time of infinite dimensions. The John Silence stories sit at the nexus of what SF historian Paul March Russell has described as this era's mesh of mathematics and mysticism. Like other weird fiction authors, Blackwood was a member of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, a society devoted to the semi-scientific study and practices of the occult, metaphysics, and the paranormal. Paranormal researchers of the era were enthralled by theories of higher dimensional spaces which, since the 1880s, had been promulgated by the eminent mathematician Charles Howard Hinton, who urged dimension-curious seekers to develop their intuitive perception of hyperspace. Blackwood's stories offer us a visceral sense of the appeal of a research methodology that can marry the thrill of scientific discovery with the irrational awe vouchsafed by a vision, like poor Mudge's, of a monstrous world so utterly different to all we know and see that I cannot even hint at the nature of the sights and objects and beings in it. One of the most popular authors of weird fiction in the United States, different stories, per pulp magazine editors at the time, was Abraham Merritt, who wrote as A. Merritt. That is Merritt, as opposed to one R, one T. His SF-inflected novels of the era, including The Moon Pool in 1918 and The Face in the Abyss in 1923, suggested that alien races and ancient technologies were to be discovered beneath the surface of everyday life. Literally beneath the surface, as the explorer Stanton discovers, to his horror, in The People of the Pit, January 5, 1918, in All Story Weekly. Stanton recounts his sojourn in an underground Alaskan city inhabited by fiends like the ghosts of inconceivably monstrous slugs. A canyon is so deep, we read, that it's like peeping over the edge of a cleft world down into the infinity where the planets roll. Describing altar carvings, Stanton insists that the human eye cannot grasp them any more than it can grasp the shapes that haunt the fourth dimension. If this language reminds you of H.P. Lovecraft's, the story was in fact a key influence on At the Mountains of Madness and other Lovecraft efforts. By today's standards, as the Golden Age SF author Jack Williamson, who got his start during the Radium Age, would recall years later, the kind of style Merritt was creating seems excessive, florid, and adjective-laden. However, as Williamson goes on to insist, Merritt's proto-SF stories, which hinted at cosmic horror beyond our ken, will reward today's SF readers' attention, thanks to their emphasis on color, wonder, the magic of sheer imagination. In George Allen England's The Thing from Outside, a creature that may hail not merely from off-world, but from a dimension outside the universe, stalks an expedition in the Canadian wilderness. A science fictional updating of Blackwood's 1910 horror tale, The Wendigo, the story appeared in the April 1923 issue of Hugo Gernsback's magazine Science and Invention. England, a popular American pulp fiction writer best known for his racist Darkness and Dawn trilogy, creates here an atmosphere of stifling paranoia. Jandron, a geologist, feels a gnawing at the base of his brain. Members of the expedition begin to perceive reality as though through a glass darkly. They quarrel and turn on one another, all of which may remind John Carpenter fans of The Thing. Which would make perfect sense, since Carpenter's 1982 movie, set in Antarctica, is an adaptation of Golden Age SF writer and editor John W. Campbell's 1938 story, Who Goes There?, which was influenced by The Thing from Outside. Which reminds me, at some point we're absolutely going to read Who Goes There. That story is petrifying. It is so good. It is so good. Like, I'm reading it, I'm like, there's no way this is from 1938. There's just no way. This is so good. It's a classic example of everything just comes together and you're like, oh my gosh, this fundamentally works. It's scary for basically all the same reasons that The Thing is scary. It's well done, is what I'm saying. well worth reading. I think it's 50s or early 60s movie, which is also based on that Thing from Another World, I think, is also pretty good, but parts of it kind of drag, I guess, would be how I'd say it. I'd couch it. At one point, Jandra name-checks Charles Fort, the eccentric American researcher and author who, in works like 1919's The Book of the Damned, presented readers with anomalous phenomena, criticized scientific dogmatism, and proposed semi-humorous theories about alien astronauts and the like. If you knew more, Jandron chastises his companions, whose refusal to consider Fortean theories he considers narrow-minded, you'd know a devilish sight less. This pronunciamento could be a slogan for the many proto-SF stories influenced by Fort's writings. A modernist poet, novelist, and critic who published as May Sinclair, Mary Amelia St. Clair. Oh, cute. May Sinclair. A modernist poet, novelist, and critic who published as May Sinclair, Mary Amelia St. Clair is best remembered for semi-autobiographical novels such as 1922's Life and Death of Harriet Frean. Frean? F-R-E-A-N? Frean? However, she also published supernatural and proto-SF fiction in which mysticism, spirituality, psychoanalysis, and idealist philosophy were intermingled. Playfully exploring the metaphysical and moral implications of Einstein's special theory of relativity, as well as the hyperspatial theories of scientists and psychical researchers, Sinclair's The Finding of the Absolute, 1923, in the author's collection Uncanny Stories, follows the afterlife adventures of Mr. Spaulding, a narrow-minded Kantian philosopher who is shocked to discover that his adulterous wife and her lover have been granted entrance to heaven. But his 3D worldview and value system, the spirit of Kant himself explains to him, is inadequate, because the universe operates on the rules of four-dimensional reality. One of the first critics to use the phrase stream of consciousness in a literary context, Sinclair takes us on a joyride through an unseen web, intensely vibrating, stretched through all space and all time. The ecstatic flip side of Mr. Mudge's nightmare, Mr. Spaulding's vision is of a multidimensional reality utterly plastic to our imagination and our will. Small wonder that T.S. Eliot and Jorge Luis Borges would sing the praises of the still underappreciated Sinclair. Our final story is the sole SF effort by an author who twice won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. In fact, during his lifetime, Booth Tarkington was considered America's greatest living author. If he is mostly forgotten today, it is because, like the reactionary protagonist of his 1918 novel, The Magnificent Ambersons, he was fixated on the negative consequences of progress, which may help us puzzle out the meaning of The Veiled Feminists of Atlantis, March 1926, in Forum. Written not long after the 19th Amendment guaranteed American women the right to vote, Tarkington's satire reimagines the legend of Atlantis' demise as a war between the sexes. Having agitated for the opportunity to learn the menfolk's magic, which is to say, technology sufficiently advanced to be indistinguishable from magic, the women of Atlantis achieve not only social, economic, and political equality, but predominance. At which point they willingly readopt the veils that, during their campaign for equality, they'd cast off. Outraged at their own loss of status and power, much like today's white nationalists, Atlantis' menfolk revolt. The SF historian Sam Moskowitz would anthologize Tarkington's story in a 1972 collection, When Women Rule, thus suggesting that it predicts and celebrates women's liberation. Writing in a 1980 issue of Science Fiction Studies, though, New Wave SF author Joanna Russ would disagree. One discerns the familiar charges, she writes, that the rule of women over men is unjust, but the rule of men over women was benevolent, and that women's use of power will be immoral and destructive. Readers can make up their own minds. Tarkington's Fable, as well as the other proto-SF stories collected here and in the first Voices of the Radium Age collection, not to mention the novels reissued via MIT Press's Radium Age series, can spark lively intellectual debate and send us on mind-bending voyages into the dimension of imagination. So be careful. The book you're holding practically vibrates with unknown energies and spine-tingling ultra-potentialities. The Last Days of Earth, being the story of the launching of the Red Sphere, by George C. Wallace. Written in 1901. A man and a woman sat facing each other across a table in a large room. They were talking slowly and eating their last meal on Earth. The end was near. The sun had ceased to warm, but was but a red-hot cinder outwardly, and these two, to the best of their belief, were the last people left alive in a world wilderness of ice and snow and unbearable cold. The woman was beautiful, very fair and slight, but with the tinge of health upon her delicate skin and the fire of intellect in her eyes. The man was of medium height, broad-shouldered, with wide, bald head and resolute mien, a man of courage, dauntless purpose, strenuous life. Both were dressed in long robes of a thick black material, held in at the waist by a girdle. As they talked, their fingers were busy with a row of small white knobs let into the surface of the table, and marked with various signs. At the pressure of each knob, a flap in the middle of the table opened, and a small glass vessel, with a dark, semi-liquid compound steaming in it, was pushed up. As these came, in obedience to the tapping of their fingers, the two ate their contents with the aid of tiny spoons. There was no other dining apparatus or dinner furniture upon the table, which stood upon a single but massive pedestal of gray metal. The meal over, the glasses and spoons replaced, the table surface clean and clear, a silence fell between them. The man rested his elbows upon his knees and his chin upon his upturned palms. He did not look at his fair companion, but beyond her, at a complicated structure projecting from the wall. This was the time indicator, and gave, on its various discs, the year, the month, the day, the hour, and the instant, all corrected to mean astronomical time and to the exact latitude and longitude of the place. He read the well-known symbols with defiant eyes. He saw that it was just 12:45 in the afternoon of Thursday, July 18th, 13,085 A.D. He reflected that the long association of the place with time recording had been labor spent in vain. The room was in a great building on the site of ancient Greenwich. In fact, the last name given to the locality by its now dead and cold inhabitants had been Greenwich. From the time machine, the man's gaze went round the room. He noted, with apparently keen interest, all the things that were so familiar to him: the severely plain walls, transparent on one side, but without window frame or visible door in their continuity, the chilling prospect of a faintly lit expanse of snow outside, the big telescope that moved in an airtight slide across the ceiling, and the little motor that controlled its motions. The electric radiators that heated the place, forming an almost unbroken dado round the walls, the globe of pale brilliance that hung in the middle of the room and assisted the twilight glimmer of the day, the neat library of books and photophono cylinders, and the tier of speaking machines beneath it. the bed in the further corner, surrounded by yet more radiators, the two ventilating valves, the great dull disk of the pictorial telegraph, and the thermometer let into a vacant space of floor. On this last his glance rested for some time, and the woman's also. It registered the degrees from absolute zero, and stood at a figure equivalent to 42 degrees Fahrenheit. From this telltale instrument the eyes of the two turned to each other, a common knowledge shining in each face. The man was the first to speak again. "A whole degree, Celia, since yesterday, and the dynamos are giving out a current at a pressure of 6,000 volts. I can't run them at any higher efficiency. That means that any further fall of temperature will close the drama of this planet. Shall we go tonight?" There was no quiver of fear nor hint of resentment in his voice, nor in the voice that answered him. Long ages of mental evolution had weeded all the petty vices and unreasoning passions out of the mind of man. "I am ready any time, Alwyn. I do not like to go. I do not like the risk of going, but it is our last duty to the humanity behind us, and I must be with you to the end." There was another silence between them, a silence in which the humming of the dynamos in the room below seemed to pervade the whole place, thrilling through everything with annoying audibility. Suddenly the man leaned forward, regarding his companion with a puzzled expression. "Your eyelashes are damp, Celia. You are not crying. That is too archaic." "I must plead guilty," she said, banishing the sad look with an effort. "We are not yet so thoroughly adjusted to our surroundings as to be able to crush down every weak impulse. Wasn't it the day before yesterday that you said the sun had begun to cool about 5 million years too soon for man? But I will not give way again. Shall we start at once?" "That is better. That sounds like Celia. Yes, if you wish, at once. But I had thought of taking a last look around the world, at least as far as the telegraph system is in order. We have 3 hours daylight yet." For answer, Celia came and sat beside him on the couch facing the disk of the pictorial telegraph. His left hand clasped her right. Both were cold. With his right hand he pulled over and held down a small lever under the disk, one of many, each bearing a distinctive name and numeral. A side wall became opaque. The globe ceased to be luminous. A moving scene grew out of the dullness of the disk, and a low, moaning sound stole into the room. They looked upon a telegraphically transmitted view of a place near which had once been Santiago, Chile. There were the ruins of an immense white city there now, high on the left of the picture. Down on the right, far below the well-defined marks of 6 successive beach lines, a cold sea moaned over an icy bar and dashed in semi-frozen spray under the bluff of an overhanging glacier's edge. Out to sea, great bergs drifted slowly, and the distant horizon was pale with the ice blink from vast floes. The view had scarcely lasted a moment, when a great crack appeared on the top of the ice front, and a huge fragment fell forward into the sea. It overturned on the bar, churning up a chaos of foam, and began to drift away. At the same instant came the deafening report of the breakage. There was no sign of life, neither of man nor beast, nor bird nor fish, in that cold scene. Polar bears and Arctic foxes, blubber-eating savages and hardy seals had all long since passed away, even from the tropic zone. Another lever pressed down, and the Rock of Gibraltar appeared on the disk. It rose vast and grim from the ice-arched waters of a shallow strait, with a vista of plain and mountain and glacier stretching behind it to the hazy distance. A vista of such an intolerable whiteness that the two watchers put on green spectacles to look at it. On the flat top of the rock, which ages ago had been leveled to make it an alighting station for the Continental aerial machines, rose, gaunt and frost-encrusted, the huge skeleton framework of one of the last flying conveyances used by man. Another lever, and Colombo, Ceylon, glared lifeless on the disk. Another, and Nagasaki, Japan, the terminal front of a vast glacier, frowned out over a black, ice-filling sea. Yet more levers, and yet more scenes, and everywhere ice and snow and shallow, slowly freezing seas, or countries here black and plantless, and there covered with glaciers from the crumbling hills. No sign of life save the vestiges of man's now ended reign, and of his long flight with the relentless cold. Here ruins on the ice-free levels of his city of heat, of his cities of heat. Here gigantic moats, excavated to retard the glaciers. Here canals to connect the warmer seas. And here the skeletons of huge metallic floating palaces jettisoned on some icebound coast. And everywhere that the ice had not overcome, the tall masts of the pictorial telescope, the pictorial telegraph, sending to the watchers at Greenwich by reflected Marconi waves, a presentment of each sight and sound impinging on the speculums and drums at their summits. And in every daylight scene the pale ghost of a dim red sun hung in a clear sky. In the more northern and southern views the magnetic lights were as brilliant as ever, but there were no views of the extreme polar regions. These were more inaccessible than in the remote past, for there were cakes and patches of liquid and semi-solid air. For there, cakes and patches of liquid and semi-solid air were slowly settling and spreading on land and sea. Yet more levers, and yet more, and the two turned away from the disk, and the room grew light again. "It appears just as we have seen it these last 2 years," said the man, "yet today the tragedy of it appalls me as it has never done before. I did not think, after all the years of expectation and mental schooling, that it would seem like this at the last. I feel... What? Give me a sec here. It appears just as we have seen it these last 2 years," said the man, "yet today the tragedy of it appalls me as it has never done before. I did not think, after all the years of expectation and mental schooling, that it would seem like this at the last. I feel tempted to do as our parents did, to seek the safety of the ultimate silence." "Not that, Alwyn, not that. From generation to generation this day has been foreseen and prepared for, and we promised, after we were chosen to remain, that we would not die until all the devices of our science failed. Let us go down and get ready to leave. At once." Celia's face had a glow upon it, a glow that Alwyn's caught. "I only said tempted, Celia. Were I alone, I do not think I should break my word. And I am also curious, and the old strange desire for life has come to me, and you are here. Let me kiss you, Celia. That, at least, is not archaic." They walked hand in hand to a square space marked out on the floor in a corner of the room, and one of them pressed a button on the wall. The square sank with them, lowering them into a dimmer room, where the ceaseless humming of the dynamos became a throbbing roar. They saw, with eyes long used to faint light, the 4 great alternators spinning round the armatures, felt the fanning of the rapid revolutions upon their faces. By the side of each machine they saw the large, queer-shaped chemical engines that drove them, that were fed from dripping vats, and from many actions and reactions supplied the power that stood between their owners and the cold that meant the end. Coal had long been exhausted, along with peat and wood and all inflammable oils and gases. No turbines could be worked from frozen streams and seas. No air wheels would revolve in an atmosphere but slightly stirred by a faded sun. The power in chemical actions had reaction. The power in chemical actions and reactions, in transmutations and compoundings of the elements, was the last great source of power left to man in the latter days. After a brief glance round the room, they pressed another button, and the lift went down to a still lower floor. Here a small glow lamp was turned on, and they stood before a sphere of bright red metal that filled the greater part of the room. They had not seen this many times in their lives. They had not seen this many times in their lives. Its meaning was too forcible a reminder of a prevision for the time that had at last arrived. The red sphere was made of a manufactured element, unknown except within the last 1,000,000 years, and so costly and troublesome to produce that only 2 red spheres had ever been built. It had been made 500 years before Alwyn and Celia were born. It was made for the purpose of affording the chosen survivors of humanity a means of escaping from the Earth when the chemical power proved inescapable of resisting the increasing cold. In the red sphere, Alwyn and Celia intended to leave the Earth, to plunge into space, not to seek warmth and light on any other member of the solar system, for that would be useless, but to gain the neighborhood of some yet young and fiery star. It was a terrible undertaking, as much more terrible than mere interplanetary voyages as the It was a terrible undertaking, as much more terrible than mere interplanetary voyages as the attempt of a savage to cross the Atlantic in his dugout after having learned to navigate his own narrow creek. It had been left undared until the last, when, however slight the chance of life in it, the Earth could only offer, instead, the choice of soon and certain death.
"It appears just as it did the day I first saw it and was told its purpose," said Celia, with a shudder she could not repress. "Are you sure, Alwyn, that it will carry us safely? That you can follow out the instructions?"
For generations, the red sphere and all appertaining to it had been mentioned with a certain degree of awe.
"Don't trouble yourself on that point. The instructions are simple. The necessary apparatus and the 10 years' supply of imperishable nutriment are already inside and fixed. We have only to subject the red metal to our 6,000-volt current for an hour, get inside, screw up the inlet, and cut ourselves adrift. The red metal, thus electrified, becomes, as you know, repulsive to gravitation, and will so continue for 1.5 years. By that time, as we shall travel, according to calculation, at twice the speed of light, we should be more than halfway to one of the nearer stars, and so become subject to its gravitation. With the Earth in its present position, if we start in a couple of hours, we should make F-188 Mag 2 of the 3rd order of spectra. Our sun, according to the records, belonged to the same order, and we know that it has at least 2 planets. But if we fall right into F-188 instead of just missing it, as we hope? Or if we miss, but so closely as to be fused by its heat? Or if we miss it too widely and are thrown back into space on a parabolic or hyperbolic orbit? Or if we should manage the happy medium and find there be no life, nor any chance of life, upon the planets of that system? Or if there be life, but it be hostile to us? Those are the inevitable dangers of our plunge, Celia. The balance of probabilities is in favor of either the first or second of those things befalling us. But that is not the same as absolute certainty, and the improbable may happen. Quite so, Alwyn. But do you recollect if the instructions make any references to these possibilities?
Yes. There is enough fulminate of sterarium packed in the sphere to shiver it, There is enough fulminate of sterarium packed in the sphere to shiver it and us to a fine dust in 1,000th part of a second, if we wish. We shall always have that resource. Now I'll attach the dynamo leads to the sphere. Get your little items of personal property together, and we shall be ready." Celia went up the lift again, and Alwyn, after fixing the connections to several small switches on the surface of the sphere, followed her. They sat together in the darkening twilight of the dim room above, waiting for the first hour to pass. They spoke at intervals and in fragmentary phrases. "It will be cold while the sphere is being prepared," said Alwyn.
"Yes, but we shall be together, dear, as we have been for so long now. I remember how miserable I felt when I first knew my destiny, but when I learned that you were chosen to share it with me, I was glad. But you were not, Alwyn. You loved Amy?"
"Yes."
"And you love her still, but you love me, too? Do you know why she was not chosen?"
"Yes,
I love you, Celia, though not so much as I loved Amy. They chose you instead of her, they said, because you had a stronger will and greater physical vigor. The slight curve we shall describe on rising will bring us over the heat house she and her other lover retired to after the decision, and we shall perhaps see whether they are really dead, as we believe. Amy, I remember, had an heretical turn of mind. If they are not dead, it is strange that they should not have answered our Marconi and telepathic messages after the first year. Unless, of course, as you have so often suggested, they have retired to the interior of the other red sphere. How strange that it should have been left there. If they have only enough food, they may live in it till old age intervenes, secure from all the rigors that approach. But what a tame end! What imprisonment! Terrible. I could not endure the red sphere except as we shall endure it, traveling. So the hour passed. They switched the electric current into the framework of the vehicle that was to bear them into space. All the radiators ceased to glow, and all the lights went out, leaving them in that lower room in absolute darkness and intense cold. They sat huddled together against the wall, where they could feel the thrill of the humming dynamos, embracing each other, silent and resolute, waiting for the end of the cold hour. They would find few words to speak now, but their thoughts were the busier. They thought of the glorious, yet now futile past, with all its promises shattered, its ideals valueless, its hopes unfulfilled, and seemed to feel in themselves the concentration and culmination of the woes and fears of the ages. They saw, as in one long vista, the history of the millions of vanished years, from the Earth's nebulous origin to its final ruin, from its days of 4 hours to its days of 26 and a half, from its germinating specks of primal protoplasm to its last and greatest, and yet most evil creature, man. They saw, in mental perspective, the uneven periods of human progress, the long stages of advance and retrogression, of failure and success. They saw the whole long struggle between the tendencies of egoism and altruism, and knew how these had merged at last into an automatic equilibration. And knew how these two had merged at last into an automatic equilibration of duty and desire. They saw the climax of this equilibration, the millennium of man, and they knew how the inevitable decay had followed. They saw how the knowledge of the sureness and nature of life's end had come to man, slowly at first, and not influencing him much, but gaining ever more and more power as the time grew nearer and sympathy and intellect more far-sighted and acute. How, when the cold itself began, and the temperate zone grew frigid, and the tropic temperate, and man was compelled to migrate, and his sources of heat and power failed one after the other, the knowledge of the end reacted on all forms of mental activity, throwing all thought and invention into one groove. They saw the whole course of the long fight, the ebb and flow of the struggle against the cold, in which, after each long period, it was seen that man was the loser. How men, armed with powers that to their ancestors would have made them seem as gods, had migrated to the other planets of the system, only to find that there, even on Mercury himself, the dying sun had made all life a foreknown lost battle. How many men, whole nations, had sought a premature refuge from the fear in the ultimate silence called death. They saw how all the old beliefs, down to the tiniest shreds of mysticism, had fallen from man as a worn-out garment, leaving him spiritually naked to face the terrors of a relentless cosmos. How, in the slow dissolving of the ideal future, man's duties and thoughts were once more molded with awe and reverence to the wishes of the past. They saw the closing centuries of the struggle, the discovery of the red metal, the building of the spheres that none dare venture to use, but which each succeeding and lessening generation handed down handed down to the next as a sacred heritage only to be put to test in the last resort. They remembered, in their own childhood, the Conference of the Decision, when they too had been chosen. That's TWO. When they too had been chosen, as the only pair of sufficient vigor and health and animal courage to accept the dread legacy and dare the dread adventure of seeking a fresh home in the outer vastness, so that haply the days of man might not be ended. And they remembered, only too well, how the rest of humanity, retiring to their last few houses, had one and all pledged each other to seek the silence and trouble the chilly earth no more. They knew how well that pledge had been kept, and in the darkness and silence of the room clutched each other closer and closer. And at last they heard the time indicator in the uppermost room ring the peal of the completed hour, and knew that in their own lives they must act the final scene in the long life tragedy of the earth. Alwyn's hand reached out and touched the switch, and the glow lamp sprang into radiance again. In silence he handed Celia into the sphere, which shone a deeper red now and coruscated strangely in the light, and then followed her, drawing the screw section in after him and making it secure. Within, the sphere was spacious and comfortable, and, save where thickly padded, transparent, even to the weak incandescence of the lamp. It was also pleasantly warm, for the red metal was impervious to heat. The man's hand went to the lever that worked through the shell, and pushed aside the strong jaws of the spring clamp that held the sphere down. And as it went, he looked into the woman's eyes. He hesitated. There was a light in her eyes and his, a feeling in her heart and his, that neither had seen nor experienced before. "It's madness, Celia," he said slowly. "It's not too late yet. The moment I pull this lever over the sphere will tear its way up through the building like an air bubble through water, but until then, it is not too late." This was not a question in phrase, but it was in fact. Celia did not answer. "Isn't it a miserable folly, this deference to the past? Don't we know perfectly well that death is as certain out there as here?" The man went on. Then Celia answered, "Yes, Alwyn, man, life, everything is a most miserable folly. But we have nothing to do with that. We can't help it. We don't know, until we try, what fortune may yet meet us. We should be untrue to our ancestors, cowards and recreants to ourselves, if we drew back now. Even in face of the unconscious enmity of the whole universe of matter, let us remember that we are living and conscious yet." As so often in the past, the woman was the man's strengthener in the time of need. Alwyn pulled over the lever and cried with antique impulsiveness, "Forgive me, Celia. We will not give in, not even against a hostile universe. She moves! We go!" There was a sudden shock that threw them staggering against each other for a moment, a rending, tearing, rolling crash of masonry and metal, and the red sphere rose through the falling ruins of the house and soared up into the night, slanting slightly to the west as it rose. One brief glimpse they had of the dials of the time indicator falling across a gap of the ruin, and then their eyes were busy with the white face of Earth beneath and the clear brilliance of the starry dome above. They were still clinging to each other when both caught sight of a small dark object approaching them from beneath. It came, apparently, from a black spot on the chill whiteness of the landscape to the west of their abandoned home, and it was traveling faster than themselves. They gazed down at it with sudden interest, that, as they gazed, turned into acute apprehension, and then to a numb horror. "The other sphere! Amy and her lover!" While they spoke, it grew definitely larger, and they saw that a collision was unavoidable. By what caprice of fate it had so fallen out that the helpless paths of the two red spheres should thus come to coincide in a point of space and time they could not imagine. The idea of leaving the Earth might, by magnetic sympathy, have occurred to both couples at about the same time, but the rest of the unlucky coincidence was inexplicable. They turned from looking at the second sphere and sought each other's eyes and hands, saying much by the look and pressure that words could not convey. "They did not mean to keep the pledge of the decision," said Alwyn. "The desire for life must have come to them as it came to me today, and Amy must have remembered the instructions. I can understand them coming up faster than us, because their sphere was in a sheet metal shed in the open, and so would start with less opposition and greater initial velocity. But it is strange that their path should be so nearly ours. It can only be a matter of minutes, at the rate they are gaining, before the end comes for all of us. It will be before we get through the atmosphere and gather our full speed. And it will be the end of humanity's troubled dream. And Amy is in that." The thought of possible malice, impulsive or premeditated on the part of the occupants of the second red sphere, never entered into the minds of those of the first. "The responsibility of action rests upon us," said Celia. "They evidently cannot see us against the background of the black sky. They are coming up swiftly, dear." "It will have to be that. There is no other way. Better one than both," said the man. "Be what, Alwyn?" "The fulminate of sterarium." "It will not injure them?" "No, not if we fire the fuse within about 3 minutes. It must seem hard to you, Celia, to know that my hand will send you to the silence so that Amy may have the last desperate chance of life. Somehow, these last few hours, I have felt the ancient emotions surging back." The hand that clasped his gave a gentle pressure. "And I, too, Alwyn. But their reign will be brief. I would rather die with you now than live without you. I am ready. Do not be too late with the fulminate, Alwyn." They swayed together. Their arms were about each other. Their lips met in the last kiss. While their faces were yet very near, Alwyn's disengaged right hand touched a tiny white button that was embedded in the padding of the interior. There was an instantaneous flash of light and roar of sound, and the man and woman in the second sphere were startled by the sudden glare and concussion of it, as their metal shell drove upwards through the cloud of elemental dust that was all that remained of the first red sphere and its occupants. The silence and clear darkness that had been round them a moment before had returned when they recovered their balance, and in that silence and clear darkness the man and woman who had not been chosen passed out into the abyss of the beyond, ignorant of the cause and meaning of that strange explosion in the air, and knew that they were alone in space, bound they knew not whither. Written in 1901. The Last Days of Earth by George C. Wells. That was very melancholy. That was well done. Strong Nightland vibes. Alright, give me 1 sec to slurp down some more fluid and we'll get rocking and rolling with the next tale. The Land Ironclads by H.G. Wells. 1.
The young lieutenant lay beside the war correspondent and admired the idyllic calm of the enemy's lines through his field glass. "So far as I can see," he said at last, "one man." "What's he doing?" asked the war correspondent. "Field glass at us," said the young lieutenant. "And this is war?" "No," said the young lieutenant. "It's block." "The game's a draw." "No. They've got to win or else they lose. A draw's a win for our side." They had discussed the political situation 50 times or so, and the war correspondent was weary of it. He stretched out his limbs. "I suppose it is," he yawned. "Flut!" "What was that?" "Shot at us." The war correspondent shifted to a slightly lower position. "No one shot at him," he complained. "I wonder if they think we shall get so bored we shall go home." "I wonder if they think we shall get so bored we shall go home." Better, because they're British. They're totally British, you know they are. The war correspondent made no reply. "There's the harvest, of course." "There's the harvest, of course." They had been there a month. Since the first brisk movements after the declaration of war, things had gone slower and slower, until it seemed as though the whole machine of events must have run down. To begin with, they had had almost a scampering time. The invader had come across the frontier on the very dawn of the war in half a dozen parallel columns behind a cloud of cyclists and cavalry, with a general air of coming straight on the capital, and the defender horsemen had held him up, and peppered him, and forced him to open out to outflank, and had then bolted to the next position in the most approved style, and for a couple of days, until in the afternoon, bump, they had the invader against their prepared lines of defense. He did not suffer so much as had been hoped and expected. He was coming on, it seemed, with his eyes open. He was coming on, it seemed, with his eyes open. His scouts winded the guns. Must be winded. He did not suffer so much as had been hoped and expected. He was coming on, it seemed, with his eyes open. His scouts winded the guns, and down he sat at once without the shadow of an attack and began grubbing trenches for himself, as though he meant to sit down there to the very end of time. He was slow, but much more wary than the world had been led to expect, and he kept convoys tucked in and shielded his slow-marching infantry sufficiently well to prevent any heavy adverse scoring. "But he ought to attack," the young lieutenant had insisted. "He'll attack us at dawn, somewhere along the lines. You'll get the bayonets coming into the trenches just about when you can see." Just about when you can see, the war correspondent had held until a week ago. The young lieutenant winked when he said that. It's kind of wild that this predates World War I, and yet is fairly accurately describing World War I warfare fairly quickly, in terms of trenches. Yes, we had them before, but, that was trench warfare, the war. When one early morning the men the defenders sent to lie out 500 yards before the trenches, with a view to the unexpected emptying of magazines into any night attack, gave way to causeless panic and blazed away at nothing for 10 minutes, the war correspondent understood the meaning of that wink. "What would you do if you were the enemy?" said the war correspondent suddenly. "If I had men like I've got now?" "Yes." "Take those trenches." "How?" "Oh, dodges. Crawl out halfway at night before moonrise and get into touch with the chaps we send out. Blaze at 'em if they tried to shift, and so bag some of 'em in the daylight. Learn that patch of ground by heart, lie all day in squatty holes, and come on nearer next night. There's a bit over there, lumpy ground, where they could get across to rushing distance. Easy. In a night or so. It would be a mere game for our fellows. It's what they're made for. Guns? Shrapnel and stuff wouldn't stop good men who meant business." "Why don't they do that?" "Their men aren't brutes enough, that's the trouble. They're a crowd of devitalized townsmen, and that's the truth of the matter.
They're clerks, they're factory hands, they're students, they're civilized men. They can write, they can talk, they can make and do all sorts of things, but they're poor amateurs at war. They've got no physical staying power, and that's the whole thing. They've never slept in the open one night in their lives. They've never drunk anything but the purest water company water. They've never gone short of 3 meals a day since they left their feeding bottles. Now, their cavalry never cocked leg of a horse until it enlisted 6 months ago. They ride their horses as though they were bicycles. You watch 'em. They're fools at the game, and they know it. Our boys of 14 can give their grown men points. Very well. The war correspondent mused on his face with his nose between his knuckles. If a decent civilization, he said, cannot produce better men for war than... He stopped with belated politeness. I mean, than our open-air life, said the young lieutenant politely. Exactly, said the war correspondent. Then civilization has to stop. It looks like it, the young lieutenant admitted. Sorry, I've been saying that wrong the entire time. He's a lieutenant. It's spelled lieutenant, but you know those Brits. Why do they do that, by the way? I still don't understand. The German Leutnant makes sense. Lieutenant? Come on, Britain. Come on. What are you doing? Anyway, back on track. It looks like it, the young lieutenant admitted. Civilization has science, you know, said the war correspondent. It invented and it makes the rifles and guns and things you use. Which are nice, healthy hunters and stockmen and so on. Rowdy-dowdy cowpunchers and negro whackers can use 10 times better than... What's that? What? Said the war correspondent, and then, seeing his companion busy with his field glass, he produced his own. Where? Said the war correspondent, sweeping the enemy's lines. It's nothing, said the young lieutenant, still looking. What's nothing? The young lieutenant put down his glass and pointed. I thought I saw something there, beyond the stems of those trees. Something black. What it was, I don't know. The war correspondent tried to get even by intense scrutiny. It wasn't anything, said the young lieutenant, rolling over to the darkling evening sky, and generalized, There never will be anything more forever. Unless... The war correspondent looked inquiry. They may get their stomachs wrong, or something, living without proper drains. A sound of bugles came from the tents behind. The war correspondent slid backward down the sand and stood up. Boom! Came from somewhere far away to the left. Hello! He said, hesitated, and crawled back to peer again. Firing at this time is jolly bad manners. The young lieutenant was incommunicative again for a space. Then he pointed to the distant clump of trees again. One of our big guns. They were firing that, he said. The thing that wasn't anything? Something over there, anyhow. Both men were silent, peering through their glasses for a space. Just when it's twilight, the lieutenant complained. He stood up. I might stay here a bit, said the war correspondent. The lieutenant shook his head. There's nothing to see, he apologized, and then went down to where his, I can't turn pages, little squad of sun-brown, loose-limbed men had been yarning in the trench. The war correspondent stood up also, glanced for a moment at the business-like bustle below him, gave perhaps 20 seconds to those enigmatical trees again, then turned his face toward the camp. He found himself wondering whether his editor would consider the story of how somebody thought he saw something black behind a clump of trees, and how a gun was fired at this illusion by somebody else, too trivial for public consultation. It's the only gleam of a shadow of interest, said the war correspondent, for 10 whole days. No, he said presently, I'll write that other article. Is war played out? He surveyed the darkling lines in perspective, the tangle of trenches one behind another, one commanding another, which the defender had made ready.
The shadows and mists swallowed up their receding contours, and here and there a lantern gleamed, and here and there knots of men were busy about small fires. "No troops on Earth could do it," he said. "No troops on Earth could do it," he said. He was depressed. He believed that there were other things in life better worth... Yes, he believed that there were other things in life better worth having than proficiency in war. He believed that in the heart of civilization, for all its stresses, its crushing concentrations of forces, its injustice and suffering, there lay something that might be the hope of the world, and the idea that any people, by living in the open air, hunting perpetually, losing touch with books and art and all the things that intensify life, might hope to resist and break that great development to the end of time, jarred on his civilized soul. Apt to his thought came a file of defender soldiers and passed him in the gleam of a swinging lamp that marked the way. He glanced at their red-lit faces, and one shone out for a moment, a common type of face in the defenders' ranks. Ill-shaped nose, sensuous lips, bright clear eyes full of alert cunning, slouch hat cocked on one side, and adorned with the peacock's plume of the rustic Don Juan turned soldier, a hard brown skin, a sinewy frame, an open, tireless stride, and a master's grip on the rifle. The war correspondent returned their salutations and went on his way. "Louts," he whispered. "Cunning, elementary louts. And they are going to beat the townsmen at the game of war." From the red glow among the nearer tents came first one and then half a dozen hearty voices, bawling in a drawling unison the words of a particularly slab and sentimental patriotic song. "Oh, go it," muttered the war correspondent bitterly. 2. It was opposite the trenches called... It was opposite the trenches called after Hackbone's hut that the battle began. There the ground stretched broad and level between the lines, with scarcely shelter for a lizard, and it seemed to the startled, just-awakened men who came crowding into the trenches that this was one more proof of that green inexperience of the enemy of which they had heard so much. The war correspondent would not believe his ears at first, and swore that he and the war artist, who, still imperfectly roused, was trying to put on his boots by the light of a match held in his hand, were the victims of a common illusion. Then, after putting his head in a bucket of cold water, his intelligence came back as he toweled. He listened. "Gollies," he said, "that's something more than scare firing this time. That's something more than scare firing this time. It's like 10,000 carts on a bridge of tin." There came a sort of enrichment to that steady uproar. "Machine guns!" Then, "Guns!" The artist, with one boot on, thought to look at his watch, and went to it hopping. "Half an hour from dawn," he said. "You were right about their attacking after all." Better. The war correspondent came out of the tent, verifying the presence of chocolate in his pocket as he did so. He had to halt for a moment or so until his eyes were toned down to the night a little. "Pitch," he said. He stood for a space to season his eyes before he felt justified in striking out for a black gap among the adjacent tents. The artist coming out behind him fell over a tent rope. It was 2:30 in the morning of the darkest night in time, and against a sky of dull black silk the enemy was talking searchlights, a wild jabber of searchlights. "He's trying to blind our riflemen," said the war correspondent with a flash, and waited for the artist, and then set off with a sort of discreet haste again. "Whoa," he said, presently. "Ditches!" They stopped. "It's the confounded searchlights," said the war correspondent. They saw lanterns going to and fro nearby, and men falling in to march down to the trenches. They were for following them, and then the artist began to feel his night eyes. "If we scramble this," he said, "and it's only a drain, there's a clear run up to the ridge." And that way they took. Lights came and went in the tents behind as the men turned out, and ever and again they came to broken ground and staggered and stumbled. But in a little while they drew near the crest. Something that sounded like the impact of a very important railway accident happened in the air above them, and the shrapnel bullets seethed about them like a sudden handful of hail. "Right-ho!" said the war correspondent, and soon they judged they had come to the crest and stood in the midst of a world of great darkness and frantic glares, whose principal fact was sound. Right and left of them and all about them was the uproar, an army full of magazine fire, at first chaotic and monstrous, and then, eked out by little flashes and gleams and suggestions, taking the beginnings of a shape. It looked to the war correspondent as though the enemy must have attacked in line with his whole force, in which case he was either being or was already annihilated. "Dawn and the dead," he said, with his instinct for headlines. He said this to himself, but afterwards, by means of shouting, he conveyed an idea to the artist. "They must have meant it for a surprise," he said. It was remarkable how the firing kept on. After a time he began to perceive a sort of rhythm in this inferno of noise. It would decline perceptibly, droop towards something that was comparatively a pause of inquiry. "Aren't you all dead yet?" this pause seemed to say. The flickering fringe of rifle flashes would become attenuated and broken, and the whack-bang of the enemy's big guns 2 miles away there would come up out of the deeps. Then suddenly, east or west of them, something would startle the rifles to a frantic outbreak again. The war correspondent taxed his brain for some theory of conflict that would account for this, and was suddenly aware that the artist and he were vividly illuminated. He could see the ridge on which they stood, and before them, in black outline, a file of riflemen hurrying down towards the nearer trenches. It became visible that a light rain was falling, and farther away towards the enemy was a clear space with men, our men, running across it in order. He saw one of those men throw up his hands and drop, and something else black and shining loomed up on the edge of the beam coruscating flashers, and behind it, and far away, a calm, white eye regarded the world. "Whit, whit, whit," sang something in the air, and then the artist was running for cover, and with the war correspondent behind him. Bang came shrapnel, bursting close at hand as it seemed, and our 2 men were lying flat in a dip in the ground, and the light and everything had gone again, leaving a vast note of interrogation upon the night. The war correspondent came within bawling range. "What the deuce was it? Shooting our men down!"
"Black," said the artist, "and like a fort. Not 200 yards from the first trench."
He sought for comparisons in his mind.
"Something between a big blockhouse and a giant's dish cover."
"Oh, something between a big blockhouse and a giant's dish cover," he said.
"And they were running," said the war correspondent.
"You'd run if a thing like that, searchlight to help it, turned up like a prowling nightmare in the middle of the night."
They crawled to what they judged the edge of the dip and lay regarding the unfathomable dark. For a space they could distinguish nothing, and then a sudden convergence of the searchlights of both sides brought the strange thing out again. In that flickering pallor it had the effect of a large and clumsy black insect, an insect the size of an ironclad cruiser, crawling obliquely to the first line of trenches and firing shots out of portholes in its side. And on its carcass the bullets must have been battering with more than the passionate violence of hail on a roof of tin. Then, in the twinkling of an eye, the curtain of the dark had fallen again, and the monster had vanished, but the crescendo of musketry marked its approach to the trenches. They were beginning to talk about the thing to each other, when a flying bullet kicked dirt into the artist's face, and they decided abruptly to crawl down into the cover of the trenches. They had got down with an unobtrusive persistence into the second line before the dawn had grown clear enough for anything to be seen.
They found themselves in a crowd of expectant riflemen, all noisily arguing about what would happen next. The enemy's contrivance had done execution upon the outlying men, it seemed, but they did not believe it would do any more.
"Come the day and we'll capture the lot of them,"
said a burly soldier. "Them?" said the war correspondent.
"They say there's a regular string of them crawling along the front of our lines. Who cares?"
The darkness filtered away so imperceptibly that at no moment could one declare decisively that one could see. The searchlights ceased to sweep hither and thither. The enemy's monsters were dubious patches of darkness upon the dark, and then no longer dubious, and so they crept out into distinctness. The war correspondent, munching chocolate absent-mindedly, beheld at last a spacious picture of battle under the cheerless sky, whose central focus was an array of 14 or 15 huge, clumsy shapes lying in perspective on the very edge of the first line of trenches, at intervals of perhaps 300 yards, and evidently firing down upon the crowded riflemen. They were so close in that the defenders' guns had ceased, and only the first line of trenches was in action. The second line commanded the first, and as the light grew, the war correspondent could make out the riflemen who were fighting these monsters, crouched in knots and crowds behind the transverse banks that crossed the trenches against the eventuality of an enfilade. The trenches close to the big machines were empty, save the crumpled suggestions of dead and wounded men. The defenders had been driven right and left as soon as the prow of this land ironclad had loomed up over the front of the trench. He produced his field glass and was immediately a center of inquiry from the soldiers about him. They wanted to look, they asked questions, and after he had announced that the men across the traverses seemed unable to advance or retreat, and were crouching under cover rather than fighting, he found it advisable to loan his glasses to a burly and incredulous corporal. He heard a strident voice, and found a lean and sallow soldier at his back talking to the artist. "There's chaps down there caught," the man was saying. "If they retreat, they got to expose themselves, and the fire's too straight." "They aren't firing much, but every shot's a hit."
"Oh."
"The chaps in that thing, the men who are coming up."
"Coming up where?"
Wait a minute. Oh, I don't know why I got that confused. No. I had it right. I think I might have had it flipped around. I don't know.
"There's chaps down there caught."
I don't know why we've got Australians here, but we do. The man was saying,
"If they retreat, they got to expose themselves, and the fire's too straight."
"They aren't firing much, but every shot's a hit."
"Oh?"
"The chaps in that thing, the men who are coming up."
"Coming up where?"
"We're evacuating them trenches where we can. Our chaps are coming back up the zigzags. No end of 'em hit. But when we get clear, our turn will come." Oh. I think I did have them flipped. Yeah, okay. "There's chaps down there caught," the man was saying. "If they retreat, they got to expose themselves, and the fire's too straight."
"They aren't firing much, but every shot's a hit."
"Who?"
"The chaps in that thing. The men who are coming up."
"Coming up where?"
"We're evacuating them trenches where we can. Our chaps are coming back up the zigzags. No end of 'em hit. But when we get clear, our turn'll come. Rather. These things won't be able to cross a trench or get into it. And before they can get back, our guns'll smash 'em up. Smash 'em right up. See?"
A brightness came into his eyes.
"Then we'll have a go at the beggar inside," he said.
And the war correspondent thought for a moment, trying to realize the idea. Then he set himself to recover his field glasses from the burly corporal. The daylight was getting clearer now. The clouds were lifting, and a gleam of lemon yellow amidst the level masses to the east portended sunrise. He looked again at the land ironclad. As he saw it in the bleak grey dawn, lying obliquely upon the slope and on the very lip of the foremost trench, the suggestion of a stranded vessel was very great indeed. It might have been from 80 to 100 feet long. It was about 250 yards away. Its vertical side was 10 feet high or so, smooth for that height, and then with a complex patterning under the eaves of its flattish turtle cover. This patterning was a close interlacing of portholes, rifle barrels, and telescope tubes, sham and real, indistinguishable one from the other. The thing had come into such a position as to enfilade the trench, which was empty now, so far as he could see, except for 2 or 3 crouching knots of men and the tumbled dead. Behind it, across the plain, it had scored the grass with a train of linked impressions, like the dotted tracings sea things leave in the sand. Left and right of that track, dead men and wounded men were scattered. Men it had picked off as they fled from their advanced positions in the searchlight glare from the invaders' lines. And now it lay with its head projecting a little over the trench it had won, as if it were a single sentient thing planning the next phase of its attack. He lowered his glasses and took a more comprehensive view of the situation. These creatures of the night had evidently won the first line of trenches, and the fight had come to a pause. In the increasing light he could make out by a stray shot or a chance exposure that the defenders' marksmen were lying thick in the second and third line of trenches up toward the low crest of the position, and in such of the zigzags as gave them a chance of a converging fire. The men about him were talking of guns. "We're in the line of the big guns at the crest, but they'll soon shift one to pepper them," the lean man said, reassuringly.
Whoop!
Said the corporal. Bang! 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 Whirr! It was a sort of nervous jump, and all the rifles were going off by themselves. The war correspondent found himself and the artist, 2 idle men crouched behind a line of preoccupied backs of industrious men discharging magazines. The monster had moved. It continued to move regardless of the hail that splashed its skin with bright new specks of lead. It was singing a mechanical little ditty to itself, toof, 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 and squirting out little jets of steam behind. It had humped itself up, as a limpet does before it crawls. It had lifted its skirt and displayed along the length of it feet. They were thick, stumpy feet between knobs and buttons in shape, flat, broad things reminding one of the feet of elephants or the legs of caterpillars. And then, as the skirt rose higher, the war correspondent, scrutinizing the thing through his glasses again, saw that these feet hung, as it were, on the rims of wheels. His thoughts whirled back to Victoria Street, Westminster, and he saw himself in the piping times of peace, seeking matter for an interview. Mr. Diplock, he said, and he called them pedrails. Fancy meeting them here. The marksman beside him raised his head and shoulders in a speculative mood to fire more certainly. It seemed so natural to assume the attention of the monster must be distracted by this trench before it, and was suddenly knocked backwards by a bullet through his neck. His feet flew up, and he vanished out the margin of the watcher's field of vision. The war correspondent groveled tighter, but after a glance behind him at a painful little confusion, he resumed his field glass, for the thing was putting down its feet one after the other, and hoisting itself farther and farther over the trench. Only a bullet in the head could have stopped him looking just then. The lean man with the strident voice ceased firing to turn and reiterate his point. "They can't possibly cross," he bawled. "They—" Bang! 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 Drowned everything. The lean man continued speaking for a word or so, then gave it up, shook his head to enforce the impossibility of anything crossing a trench like the one below, and resumed business once more. And all the while, that great bulk was crossing. When the war correspondent turned his glass on it again, it had bridged the trench, and its queer feet were rasping away at the farther bank, in the attempt to get a hold there. It got its hold. It continued to crawl until the greater bulk of it was over the trench. Until it was all over. Then it paused for a moment, adjusted its skirt a little nearer the ground, gave an unnerving toot-toot, and came on abruptly at a pace of, perhaps, 6 miles an hour straight up the gentle slope towards our observer. One sec. Just AI bot things.
Banished to the hell world.
Arcturus 9. The war correspondent raised himself on his elbow and looked a natural inquiry at the artist. For a moment the men about him stuck to their position and fired furiously. Then the lean man, in a mood of precipitancy, slid backwards, and the war correspondent said, "Come along," to the artist, and led the movement along the trench. As they dropped down, the vision of a hillside of trench being rushed by a dozen vast cockroaches disappeared for a space, and instead was one of a narrow passage, crowded with men, for the most part receding, though one or two turned or halted. He never turned back to see the nose of the monster creep over the brow of the trench. He never even troubled to keep in touch with the artist. He heard the whoop of bullets about him soon enough, and saw a man before him stumble and drop, and then he was one of a furious crowd fighting to get into a transverse zigzag ditch that enabled the defenders to get under cover up and down the hill. It was like a theater panic. He gathered from signs and fragmentary words that on ahead another of these monsters had also won to the second trench. He lost his interest in the general course of the battle for a space altogether. I'm going to try that again. He lost his interest in the general course of the battle for a space altogether. He became simply a modest egotist, in a mood of hasty circumspection, seeking the farthest rear amidst a dispersed multitude of disconcerted riflemen similarly employed. He scrambled down through trenches. He took his courage in both hands and sprinted across the open. He had moments of panic when it seemed madness not to be quadrupedal, and moments of shame when he stood up and faced about to see how the fight was going. And he was one of many thousand very similar men that morning. On the ridge he halted in a knot of scrub, and was for a few minutes almost minded to stop and see things out. The day was now fully come. The gray sky had changed to blue, and of all the cloudy masses of the dawn there remained only a few patches of dissolving fleeciness. The world below was bright and singularly clear. The ridge was not, perhaps, more than 100 feet or so above the general plain, but in this flat region it sufficed to give the effect of extensive view. Away on the north side of the ridge, little and far, were the camps, the ordered wagons, all the gear of a big army, with officers galloping about and men doing aimless things. Here and there men were falling in, however, and the cavalry was forming up on the plain beyond the tents? What? Here and there men were falling in, however, and the cavalry was forming up on the plain beyond the tents. One thing I'll give CJ Cherry, at least when she has extra commas, you know how the rhythm goes, whereas this one is like, here and there men were falling in, comma, however, and the cavalry was forming up on the plain beyond the tents, period. Or you should have put the comma after the however, whatever. The bulk of men who had been in the trenches were still on the move to the rear, scattered like sheep without a shepherd over the farther slopes. Here and there were little rallies and attempts to wait and do something vague, but the general drift was away from any concentration. There on the southern side was the elaborate lacework of trenches and defenses, across which these iron turtles, 14 of them spread out over a line of perhaps 3 miles, were now advancing as fast as a man could trot, and methodically shooting down and breaking up any persistent knots of resistance. Here and there stood little clumps of men, outflanked and unable to get away, showing the white flag, and the invaders' cyclist infantry was advancing now across the open, And the invaders' cyclist infantry was advancing now across the open, in open order but unmolested, to complete the work of the machines. Surveyed at large, the defenders already looked a beaten army. A mechanism that was effectually ironclad against bullets, that could at a pinch cross a 30-foot stretch, and that seemed able to shoot out rifle bullets with unerring precision, was clearly an inevitable victor against anything but rivers, precipices, and guns. He looked at his watch. 4:30. Lord, what things can happen in 2 hours! Here's the whole blessed army being walked over, and at 2:30.
And even now our blessed louts haven't done a thing with their guns.
He scanned the ridge right and left of him with his glasses. He turned again to the nearest land ironclad, advancing now obliquely to him and not 300 yards away, and then scrambled to the ground over which he must retreat if he was not to be captured.
"They'll do nothing," he said, and glanced again at the enemy.
And then, from far away to the left, came a thud of a gun, followed very rapidly by a rolling gunfire. He hesitated, and decided not to stay. "3. The defender had relied chiefly upon his rifles in the event of an assault. His guns he kept concealed at various points upon and behind the ridge, ready to bring them into action against any artillery preparations for an attack on the part of his antagonist. The situation had rushed upon him with the dawn, and by the time the gunners had their guns ready for motion, the land ironclads were already in among the foremost trenches. There is a natural reluctance to fire into one's own broken men, and many of the guns, being intended to simply fight an advance of the enemy's artillery, were not in positions to hit anything in the second line of trenches. After that, the advance of the land ironclads was swift. The Defender General found himself suddenly called upon to invent a new sort of warfare, in which guns were to fight alone amidst broken and retreating infantry. They had scarcely 30 minutes in which to think it out. He did not respond to the call, and what happened that morning was that the advance of the land ironclads forced the flight, and each gun and battery made what play its circumstances dictated. For the most part, it was poor play. Some of the guns got in 2 or 3 shots, some 1 or 2, and the percentage of misses was unusually high. The howitzers, of course, did nothing. The land ironclads in each case followed much the same tactics. As soon as a gun came into play, the monster turned itself almost end-on, so as to minimize the chances of a square hit, and made not for the gun, but for the nearest point on its flank from which the gunners could be shot down. Few of the hits scored were very effectual. Only one of the things was disabled, and that was the one that fought the 3 batteries attached to the brigade on the left wing. 3 that were hit when close upon the guns were clean shot through without being put out of action. Our war correspondent did not see that one momentary arrest of the tide of victory on the left. He saw only the very ineffectual flight of half battery 96B close at hand upon his right. This he watched some time beyond the margin of safety. Just after he heard the 3 batteries opening up upon his left, he became aware of the thud of horses' hoofs from the sheltered side of the slope, and presently saw first 1 and then 2 other guns galloping into position along the north side of the ridge, well out of sight of the great bulk that was now creeping obliquely towards the crest and cutting up the lingering infantry beside it and below as it came. The half-battery swung round into line, each gun describing its curve, halted, unlimbered, and prepared for action. Bang! The land ironclad had become visible over the brow of the hill, and just visible as a long black back to the gunners. It halted, as though it hesitated. The two remaining guns fired, and then their big antagonist had swung round and was in full view, end on, against the sky, coming at a rush. The gunners became frantic in their haste to fire again. They were so near the war correspondent could see the expressions on their excited faces through his field glass. As he looked, he saw a man drop, and realized for the first time that the Ironclad was shooting. For a moment, the big black monster crawled with an accelerated pace towards the furiously active gunners. Then, as if moved by a generous impulse, it turned its full broadside to their attack, and scarcely 40 yards away from them. The war correspondent turned his field glass back to the gunners and perceived it was now shooting down the men about the guns with the most deadly rapidity. Just for a moment it seemed splendid, and then it seemed horrible. The gunners were dropping in heaps about their guns. To lay a hand on a gun was death. Bang! Went the gun on the left, a hopeless miss, and that was the only second shot of the half-battery fired. In another moment, 6 surviving artillerymen were holding up their hands amidst a scattered muddle of dead and wounded men, and the fight was done. The war correspondent hesitated between stopping in his scrub and waiting for an opportunity to surrender decently, or taking to an adjacent gully he had discovered. If he surrendered, it was certain he would get no copy off, while, if he escaped, there were all sorts of chances. He decided to follow the gully, and take the first offer in the confusion beyond the camp of picking up a horse. Subsequent authorities have found fault with the first land ironclads in many particulars, but assuredly they served their purpose on the day of their appearance. They were essentially long, narrow, and very strong steel frameworks carrying the engines, and borne upon 8 pairs of big pedrail wheels, each about 10 feet in diameter, each a driving wheel and set upon long axles free to swivel round a common axis. This arrangement gave them the maximum of adaptability to the contours of the ground. They crawled level along the ground with 1 foot high upon a hillock and then another deep in a depression, and they could hold themselves erect and steady sideways upon even a steep hillside. The engineers directed the engines under the command of the captain, who had lookout points at small ports all round the upper edge of the adjustable skirt of 12-inch iron plating which protected the whole affair, and could also raise or depress a conning tower set about the portholes through the center of the iron top cover. The riflemen each occupied a small cabin of peculiar construction, and these cabins were slung along the sides of and before and behind the great main framework, in a manner suggestive of the slinging of the seats of an Irish jaunting car. Their rifles, however, were very different pieces of apparatus from the simple mechanisms in the hands of their adversaries. These were, in the first place, automatic, ejected their cartridges and loaded again from a magazine each time they fired, until the ammunition store was at an end, and they had the most remarkable sights imaginable, sights which threw a bright little camera obscura picture into the light, tight box in which the riflemen sat below. This camera obscura picture was marked with 2 crossed lines, and whatever was covered by the intersection of these 2 lines, that the rifle hit. The sighting was ingeniously contrived. The rifleman stood at the table with a thing like an elaborate tree. No. What the hell? The rifleman stood at the table with a thing like an elaborately of a draftsman's dividers in his hand. Anyway, the sighting was ingeniously contrived. The rifleman stood at the table with a thing like an elaborately of a draftsman's dividers in his hand, and he opened and closed these dividers so that they were always at the apparent height, if it was an ordinary-sized man, of the man he wanted to kill. A little twisted strand of wire, like an electric light wire, ran from this implement up to the gun, and as the dividers opened and shut, the sights went up and down. Changes in the clearness of the atmosphere, due to changes of moisture, were met by an ingenious use of that meteorologically sensitive substance, catgut, and when the land ironclad moved forward, the sights got a compensatory deflection in the direction of its motion. The rifleman stood up in his pitch-dark chamber and watched the little picture before him. One hand held the dividers for judging distance, and the other grasped a big knob like a door handle. As he pushed this knob about, the rifle above swung to correspond, and the picture passed to and fro like an activated panorama. When he saw a man he wanted to shoot, he brought him up to the cross lines, and then pressed a finger upon a little push like an electric bell push, conveniently placed in the center of the knob. Then the man was shot. If by any chance the rifleman missed his target, he moved the knob a trifle, or readjusted his dividers, pressed the push, and got him the second time. This rifle and its sights protruded from a porthole, exactly like a great number of other portholes that ran in a triple row under the eaves of the cover of the land ironclad. Each porthole displayed a rifle and sight in dummy, so that the real ones could only be hit by a chance shot. And if one was, then the young man below said, "Pshaw!" turned on an electric light, lowered the injured instrument into his camera, replaced the injured part, or put up a new rifle if the injury was considerable. You must conceive these cabins as hung clear above the swing of the axles, and inside the big wheels upon which the great elephant-like feet were hung, and behind these cabins along the center of the monster ran a central gallery into which they opened, and along which worked the big compact engines. It was like a long passage into which this throbbing machinery had been packed, and the captain stood about the middle, close to the ladder that led to his conning tower, and directed the silent, alert engineers, for the most part by signs. The throb and noise of the engines mingled with the reports of the rifles and the intermittent clangor of the bullet hail upon the armor. Ever and again he would touch the wheel that raised his conning tower, step up his ladder until his engineers could see nothing of him above the waist, and then come down again with orders. 2 small electric lights were all the illumination of this space. They were placed to make him most clearly visible to his subordinates. The air was thick with the smell of oil and petrol, and had the war correspondent been suddenly transferred from the spacious dawn outside to the bowels of the apparatus, he would have thought himself fallen into another world. The captain, of course, saw both sides of the battle. When he raised his head into the conning tower, there were the dewy sunrise, the amazed and disordered trenches, the flying and falling soldiers, the depressed-looking groups of prisoners, the beaten guns. When he bent down again to signal half speed, quarter speed, half circle round towards the right, or what not, he was in the oil-smelling twilight of the ill-lit engine room. Close beside him, on either side, was the mouthpiece of a speaking tube, and ever and again he would direct one side or another of his strange craft to concentrate fire forward on gunners, or to clear out trench about 100 yards on our right front. He was a young man, healthy enough, but by no means sun-tanned, and of a type of feature and expression that prevails in His Majesty's Navy: alert, intelligent, quiet. He and his engineers and his riflemen all went about their work, calm and reasonable men. They had none of that flapping strenuousness of the half-wit in a hurry, that excessive strain upon the blood vessels, that hysteria of effort which is so frequently regarded as the proper state of mind for heroic deeds. For the enemy these young engineers were defeating, they felt a certain qualified pity, and a quite unqualified contempt. They regarded these big, healthy men they were shooting down precisely as these same big, healthy men might regard some inferior kind of native. They despised them for making war, despised their bawling patriotisms and their emotionality profoundly, despised them, above all, for the petty cunning and the almost brutish want of imagination their method of fighting displayed. If they must make war, these young men thought, why in thunder don't they do it like sensible men? They resented the assumption that their own side was too stupid to do anything more than play their enemy's game, that they were going to play this costly folly according to the rules of unimaginative men. They resented being forced to the trouble of making man-killing machinery, resented the alternative of having to massacre these people or endure their truculent yappings, resented the whole unfathomable imbecility of war. Meanwhile, with something of the mechanical precision of a good clerk posting a ledger, the riflemen moved their knobs and pressed their buttons. The captain of Land Ironclad No. 3 had halted on the crest close to his captured half-battery. His lined-up prisoners stood hard by and waited for the cyclists behind to come for them. He surveyed the victorious morning through his conning tower. He read the general's signals. 5 and 4 are to keep among the guns to the left and prevent any attempt to recover them. 7 and 11 and 12 stick to the guns you have got. 7 get into position to command the guns taken by 3. Then we are to do something else, are we? 6 and 1 quicken up to about 10 miles an hour and walk around behind that camp up to the levels near the water, near the river. We shall bag the whole crowd of them, interjected the young man. Ah, here we are. 2 and 3, 8 and 9, 13 and 14, space out to 1,000 yards, wait for the word, then go slowly to cover the advance of the cyclist infantry against any charge of mounted troops. That's all right. But where's 10? Hallo? 10 to repair and get movable as soon as possible. They've broken up 10. The discipline of the new war machines was businesslike rather than pedantic, and the head of the captain came down out of the conning tower to tell his men, I say, you chaps there, they've broken up 10. Not badly, I think, but anyhow, he's stuck. But that still left 13 of the monsters in action to finish up the broken army. The war correspondent, stealing down his gully, looked back and saw them all lying along the crest and talking fluttering congratulatory flags to one another. Their iron sides were shining golden in the light of the rising sun. "5. The private adventures of the war correspondent terminated in surrender about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and by that time he had stolen a horse, pitched off it, and narrowly escaped being rolled upon, found the brute had broken its leg, and shot it with his revolver. He had spent some hours in the company of a squad of dispirited riflemen, had quarreled with them about topography at last, and gone off by himself in a direction that should have brought him to the banks of the river, and didn't. Moreover, he had eaten all his chocolate and found nothing in the whole world to drink. Also, it had become extremely hot. From behind a broken but attractive stone wall, he had seen far away in the distance the defender horsemen trying to charge cyclists in open order, with land ironclads outflanking them on either side. He had discovered that cyclists could retreat over open turf before horsemen with a sufficient margin of speed to allow... Oh, I see. He had discovered that cyclists could retreat over open turf before horsemen with a sufficient margin of speed to allow of frequent dismounts and much terribly effective sharpshooting, and he had a sufficient persuasion that those horsemen, having charged their hearts out, had halted just beyond his range of vision and surrendered. He had been urged to sudden activity by a forward movement of one of those machines that had threatened to enfilade his wall. He had discovered a fearful blister on his heel. He was now in a scrubby, gravelly place, sitting down and meditating on his pocket handkerchief. He was now in a scrubby, gravelly place, sitting down and meditating on his pocket handkerchief, which had in some extraordinary way become in the last 24 hours, extremely ambiguous in hue. "It's the whitest thing I've got," he said. He had known all along that the enemy was east, west, and south of him, but when he heard war ironclads numbers 1 and 6 talking in their measured, deadly way not half a mile to the north, he decided to make his own little unconditional peace without any further risks. He was for hoisting his white flag to a bush, and taking up a position of modest obscurity near it, until someone came along. He became aware of voices, clatter, and the distinctive noises of the body of horse, quite near, and he put his handkerchief in his pocket again and went to see what was going on. The sound of firing ceased, and then, as he drew near, he heard the deep sounds of many simple, coarse, but hearty and noble-hearted soldiers of the old school swearing with vigor. He emerged from his scrub upon a big level plain, and far away a fringe of trees marked the banks of the river. In the center of the picture was a still intact road bridge, and a big railway bridge a little to the right. 2 land ironclads rested, with a general air of being long, harmless sheds, in a pose of anticipatory peacefulness, right and left of the picture, completely commanding 2 miles and more of the river levels. Emerged and halted a few yards beyond the scrub was the remainder of the defenders' cavalry, dusty, a little disordered, and obviously annoyed, but still a very fine show of men. In the middle distance, 3 or 4 men and horses were receiving medical attendance, and nearer a knot of officers regarded the distant novelties in mechanism with profound distaste. Everyone was very distinctly aware of the 12 other ironclads, and of the multitude of townsmen soldiers, on bicycles or afoot, encumbered now by prisoners and captured war gear, but otherwise thoroughly effective, who were sweeping like a great net in their rear. "Checkmate," said the war correspondent, walking out into the open, "but I surrender in the best of company. 24 hours ago I thought war was impossible, and these beggars have captured the whole blessed army. Well, well." He thought of his talk with the young lieutenant. If there's no end to the surprises of science, the civilized people have it, of course. As long as their science keeps going, they will necessarily be ahead of open countrymen. Still, he wondered for a space what might have happened to the young lieutenant. The war correspondent was one of those inconsistent people who always want the beaten side to win. When he saw all these burly, sun-tanned horsemen, disarmed and dismounted and lined up, when he saw their horses unskillfully led away by the singularly not equestrian cyclists to whom they had surrendered, when he saw these truncated paladins watching this scandalous sight, he forgot altogether that he had called these men cunning louts, and wished them beaten not 24 hours ago. A month ago he had seen that regiment in its pride going forth to war, and had been told of its terrible prowess, how it could charge in open order with each man firing from his saddle, and sweep before it anything else that ever came out to battle in any sort of order, foot or horse. And it had had to fight a few score of young men in atrociously unfair machines. "Manhood versus machinery," occurred to him as a suitable headline. Journalism curdles all one's mind to phrases. He strolled as near the lined-up prisoners as the sentinels seemed disposed to permit, and surveyed them and compared their sturdy proportions with those of their lightly built captors. "Smart degenerates," he muttered. "Anemic cockneydom." The surrendered officers came quite close to him presently, and he could hear the colonel's high-pitched tenor. The poor gentleman had spent 3 years of arduous toil upon the best material in the world perfecting that shooting from the saddle charge, and he was mourning with phrases of blasphemy, natural under the circumstances, what one could be expected to do against this suitably consigned ironmongery.
"Guns," said someone.
"Big guns they can walk around. You can't shift big guns to keep pace with 'em, and little guns in the open and rush. I saw 'em rushed. You might do a surprise now and then. Assassinate the brutes, perhaps."
"You might make things like 'em."
"What? More ironmongery? Ours?" "I'll call my article," meditated the war correspondent, "Mankind versus Ironmongery," and quote the old boy at the beginning.
and he was much too good a journalist to spoil his contrast by remarking that the half-dozen comparatively slender young men in blue pajamas who were standing about their victorious land ironclad, drinking coffee and eating biscuits, had also in their eyes and carriage something not altogether degraded below the level of a man. And that was The Land Ironclads by H.G. Wells, written in 1903. And that is where we will call it for today. Those were cute. Bit of early military sci-fi and a bit of very melancholy sci-fi earlier. So tomorrow... Let me get out the listy. Let me get out the list here. What are we looking at? Oi. How long is the third drug, eh? Hopefully it's not too long. It's not. Yeah, it's about another 50 pages. Okay, so yeah, we'll just do 2 more stories tomorrow. And then I have to find out what my schedule is, and we'll go from there.
Yay! Uncertainty, it's fun! Whee!
Anywho, let me get this bookmark in here. Come on! Alright, anything salient beyond that? No, nothing, not really. Good. Alright, let's just check to see if I've got any new comments of note, rather. Namely, have I been banished? I do not appear to have been banished. This is good. Derpy Shark says, it's always interesting to me how some of these older stories seem particularly modern, but were written over 100 years ago in some cases. Yeah, it really is. Yeah, like in that last collection, there were, oh my gosh, there was the one that totally presaged YouTube reaction videos, amazingly. I can't remember the name of that story. Go find the Voices from the Radium Age playlist. It'll be in there. That one was wild. That one blew me away. A lot of them blew me away. Some of them were very good. I guess part of it has to do with the human condition and the fact that we're not that far removed at the end of the day from all that. And people don't seem to change that much, I suppose. Just some of our circumstances do, some geopolitics does, but like fundamentally we're still kind of the same hairless apes doing the same hairless ape things. Our values haven't shifted that dramatically in that time. They have shifted, for sure. In my opinion, mostly for the better. Particularly as regards race and gender. I think we've gotten better in general at being more accepting of that. Now that may turn out to be I know some people claim, oh, that's a fatal flaw, you can't, have liberal-minded ideals like those, it'll kill the species. And I'm like, I don't really see how. We're not going to somehow magically not breed. Like, we're going to breed. Now, of course, counterpoint, you've got a bunch of countries that have, negative birth rates, but that doesn't mean the human species is going to go extinct as a result of not, banging. What would be required is, mass infertility. Barring that, I don't see that happening. So we'll keep on. I hate to make the comparison, but honestly, we're like friggin' cockroaches, man. Even after the climate apocalypse in, call it 30-odd years, we'll still have people around. We'll still have human beings running around. For sure. Human civilization will be toast, at least in a way that we recognize, probably. But
we'll still be around and we'll still be doing human stories. Like these, hopefully. Hopefully slightly more optimistic. But yeah, I liked the ending of that last one where it's like, those people who, those horrible savages, who built these unfair land ironclads, had also in their eyes and carriage something not altogether degraded below the level of a man. They're people too. We are our own worst enemy, I guess, is part of what that story is going for, which, is a pretty universal theme, which I always find interesting, especially when you've got, kind of social conflicts, where it's sort of pointing out that, we have these societal impulses that society tells us we should be like X, Y, or Z. We should have such and such moral values. And those things are, kind of ephemeral. But one of the things that I find interesting is with, older literature like this, is how, there's that constant war, that constant dichotomy between, what we think is good and what we're realistically going to ever be doing. And it's usually the thing we're ever going to be doing is some sort of horrible conflict. Even though we're like, well, we should respect our fellow man. It's like, well, we're going to do the opposite of that because I'm not saying that natural state is better than insert social mores here. But, and of course, anytime I say the word social mores, I've been so badly brain broken that the Gary Larson single panel Far Side comic of social mores, which is it's a bunch of moray eels at a drinking party. It's silly. At a dinner function. If I could find an image very quickly, I would do it, but I'm not going to search for it right now. Suffice it to say, it's out there, and it's very much a thing. And it's cute. Anyway, that's it for me today. Hopefully people enjoyed. I know I did. I'm sort of on the mend. My sinuses are slightly less infected at the moment.
There's still some serious post-nasal drip action going on, but you don't need to hear that.
But yeah, anyway, fun stuff. The MIT Press has some bangers again, it seems. So I'm happy about that. Alrighty, I'll see you all tomorrow, and when I know my schedule for next week, I'll post it. I'm sorry I didn't post mine for this week. It was very, it's been, kind of crazy in terms of lack of information flow and me having to, jump on problems and fix them in rather short order. Anyway, see you all tomorrow. Stay safe, stay sane, be decent to each other.